Hi everyone. First of all, thank you all so much for coming and for making time to join us for what promises to be an absolutely fantastic talk. It's great to see some returning guests as well as a great many new faces. Today, we at the Control Network are joined by Associate Professor Dr. Başak Ağin at TED University and Şafak Horzum, Fulbright Scholar and former Harvard University Fellow. Başak is Associate Professor of English Literature at TED University and author of the Turkish monograph Posthumanism, Concept, Theory, Science Fiction in 2020, the sound of which makes me wish I could read Turkish. She's likewise co-editor of the forthcoming collection Posthuman Pathogenesis, Contagion in Literature, Media and Arts, which is being published by Routledge in June this year, and which me and my colleague Jade Martin have contributed to. They're fantastic editors. Furthermore, she is also the founder and head editor of Pentacle, the Turkish journal dedicated to environmental posthumanities. Şafak is a Fulbright Scholar, former fellow at Harvard, co-editor of Posthuman Pathogenesis, and is currently trying to finalize his PhD dissertation at Hacettepe University. He works as a lecturer at Ankara Science University and will shortly visit Munster University for his research. It's great to have you both here. The talk today is entitled Eloquent Natures, Ecofeminism and Posthuman Materialities, and it will be divided into two parts. Firstly, Başak will problematize the conflict between ecofeminism and material feminisms, which have more common ground than they are usually thought to, pointing out the intersections between them and their relation to new materialism. She exemplifies these intersections in rewritings of Medusa myths in social networking spaces and the poetry of Rumi. In the second half, Şafak concentrates on posthuman materialities as eloquent storytelling bodies, drawing examples from Gulliver's Travels, the Alice stories, all the way through to 21st century science fiction novels. He's moving towards a more interactive talk, and he will also explain how various genres show what it means to be a posthuman agentic body capable of narration. As ever, this talk itself will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel, but the Q&A will not. If you do have any questions, please feel free to use the raise your hand feature, but for the moment, please, if you'd like to keep yourselves muted and use your cameras like whichever way. But without further ado, please welcome Başak and Şafak.
Thank you so much for having us. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon for those in the UK. Good evening for those in Turkey. And it's a great honor to be part of the talks in the CTRL network here. So I must underline before I begin my words that this talk is actually derived from a book chapter, which I have recently finished working on. And it will be published as part of Routledge Handbook of Ecofeminist Literature, edited by Douglas Wackoch. So I'm going to be asking Şafak to assist me in moving along the slides, so perhaps he could move on to the next slide to introduce my outline. Yeah, so this is going to be my outline. I will start with mentioning a very common problem in academia all around the world, which is the problem of critiquing or criticizing one another. And this is something I call the seeming theory battles. And it looks as if there is a fight between various approaches to theory, especially different strands of feminism. But this goes beyond such battle and turns into an exchange of insults between renowned or perhaps lesser known academics. And this is really disturbing for all of us at every career level. And I will also focus on how ecofeminists and new materialists kind of struggle with one another. Something that proves quite counterintuitive, if you ask me, and this is a fruitless discussion, because my point here is that they could have fed each other rather than attack each other, and there is this struggle for overcoming the dichotomy of unity versus difference in Western thought, and I believe this is something that still persists in Western thought, in Western philosophy, although posthumanism and its especially new materialist veins are arguing for a complete deconstruction of binary oppositions. So as you know, such deconstructive methodology is a follow-up to the postmodern or the post-structuralist turn. And posthumanism strives to achieve what this linguistic turn or cultural turn could not achieve to do due to its overemphasis on discourse. However, I still see here a problem with the approach, even though it's post-humanist. And this becomes more obvious if we continue to view differences not as opportunities for growth and union, but as weapons of mass academic destruction. This is why I pointed out the second title here. And I will exemplify my points with reference to Rumi's poetry. This is someone that the English-speaking world calls Rumi, but we call him Mevlana. So I will be using the names interchangeably. And I will be referring to the rewriting of the Medusa myth over contemporary online sources as well, which I believe converse very well with material eco-criticism and storied matter. And as you know, material eco-criticism and its concept of storied matter are the latest brainchild of new materialisms. However, I'm trying to shift the focus from the anthropomorphized notion of eloquent or storied matter here, because I see a problem related to it again. And I suggest here calling this matter text, a term that I coined instead of storied matter, with a slight diffractive approach. And I will explain why I think so. But let me warn you beforehand, of course, this talk is not going to be a linear one. It is rather rhizomatic in the sense that it follows the story of an academic incident, or rather, should I say, perhaps an accident that happened to me. So, Şafak, may I ask you to move along with the next slide, please? Right. So, as you can see, this meme, Medusa was defending herself. So, this is going to take me to the problem of critique. So, when this meme that you see on the screen went viral around early 2020, I was actually trying to recover emotionally from the harsh critique I received from a well-known female scholar. And this was someone who was not familiar with my previous work, but she knew who I was, where I came from, what career level I was at, and I was much less experienced than her. So we probably think that this scholarship goes like a master-apprentice relationship, but things don't always turn out to be so, as you know. And this person was trained and taught in the same areas that I did, my being an English and British cultural studies and literary studies scholar, first of all. Although she obviously walked through a different pathway, a predominantly Western one, to reach the culmination of her philosophy. So she gave feedback on my paper, knowing what she was doing exactly, but she completely rejected my ideas. My idea was that basically we could establish bonds between écriture féminine, the French feminist écriture féminine, and posthuman ecological strands of feminism, such as ecofeminism and material eco-criticism, because why not? But she completely rejected the idea, and not because I am unable to handle rejection, but her words were really harsh, and that is what hurt me most. And she blamed me for not. I remember one of the comments was going along the lines of, the author does not know how the bios-zoe dichotomy informed biopolitics and stuff. And my PhD dissertation being entitled Posthuman Ecologies, I felt literally devastated because from my perspective, she had an approach which was too limited to the strict standards of binary thinking. But I couldn't explain myself because that was a rejection after all. Well, this happens to the best of us. And I see this is happening quite often. And even big names such as Karen Barad, for example, they have been targeted. She was attacked over, Barad was attacked over the idea of posthumanist performativity when she first released the article in 2003, and she was accused of obsessing over matter, for example. And many scholars working on new materialisms have been criticized, either for fetishizing or objectifying matter, or for neglecting or ignoring the contributions of ecofeminism to the development of some of its underlying notions, such as the entwinement of the material and the cultural, or the dismantling of Western dualisms. So I'm not going to here discuss to what extent these criticisms fall apt, because some of them do indeed. For example, Greta Garth's critique, her criticism could be quite apt. We're not there yet, Şafak. Okay, thank you. She bases the argument on the question of where ecofeminists are. They are not mentioned at all, although they provided the basis for some of the underlying thoughts in posthumanism. Another one is Marianne Costello's critique, but it's a compare-contrast approach. However, I feel that these critiques take us to several pathways. Okay, so now we can move on. So the first pathway is that it is unclear in these critiques whether material eco-criticism also receives its share from such critiques, because these critiques are targeting new materialisms, not material eco-criticism per se. But and on the left-hand side, you see that why these aren't targeting probably material eco-criticism, because first of all, Sarah Ahmed's position paper, which blames Karen Barat for fetishizing matter, predates the emergence of material eco-criticism, which was coined in around 2012 and which was literally theorized in 2014. And we see Greta Gar's frequent citation and collaboration with Serpil Operman, and it tells much about their not only personal friendship, but also their theorizing together. So clearly, material eco-criticism is not the target here. But then again, we have Marianne Costello and Sherilyn McGregor who sort of attack. I mean, Costello's article is a compare-contrast approach, but Sherilyn McGregor is really defending ecofeminism as if it is something opposing new materialisms. But she does not mention, they both, neither of them mention material eco-criticism. But on the right-hand side, there are some issues that we need to keep in mind. First of all, material eco-criticism is situated in the conceptual horizons of the new materials paradigm. Therefore, whatever kind of critique is directed at new materialism in the sense that they are arguing for the aliveness or vibrancy of matter, then it affects material eco-criticism. And also, material eco-critical theory is defined as a diptych. It's like a painting on two panels, and one of these panels is ecological postmodernism, and the other is the new materialist theory. So there is still some ambivalence whether it receives those critiques, its share of those critiques, but I believe it is. The problem is that because material eco-criticism highlights the storytelling qualities of matter, it is often misunderstood as anthropocentric. So the use of anthropomorphism here, I mean, matter being a storyteller, it's a viable tool, it's a useful strategy to imagine what agency in an other than human form would look like, for example, as Şafak will exemplify through his survey of genres. Those who do not follow the new material strengths are often misguided by it because they speak probably a different language. And this is why I'd like to highlight textuality here rather than narrativity with my concept matter text, rather than Iovino and Operman's storied matter. So this is just a focus shift. I mean, matter text is just a focus shift from storied matter, and it's a diffractive approach to material eco-criticism. So rather than moving along with the lines of the diptych, which is like ecological postmodernism and the new materialist series, I'm adding a third panel and I'm making it a triptych. And that third panel is a combination of equatorial feminine and posthuman feminism. So let's move along. So here's a funny meme. So from Rumi, and I'm also drinking coffee with a Rumi cup. It's interesting. I wasn't planning to use this one, but I mean, it just came along in the kitchen. I just found myself drinking with it. It's really strange how things are talking to you in certain ways. So there were three eloquent bodies that resolved my conflict with the coinage of matter text. Remember the rejection that I received and remember the harsh critique that I received. So, okay, finally, I managed to emotionally recover from that critique. And there were three helpful bodies that spoke to me. One of them was the interview that I conducted with Evelyn for Pentacle for our website that Ben mentioned in his introduction to us. And the second one was the Medusa stories that were going viral all along with that meme and surrounding the meme. And the third one was Rumi's poetry, which I grew up familiar with, of course. So the next one. So the third panel that I'm adding as a diffractive methodology to material eco-criticism, thus contributing to the making up of matter text is French feminism with a posthuman twist. So let's take a look at what I had in mind when I tried to bring a posthuman twist into French feminism. So Helena Siksu pointed out in her Laugh of the Medusa the infinite richness of women's individual constitution, and she argued against defining female sexuality as uniform, homogeneous, classifiable into codes. She urged women to write against all odds and in their own unique ways. So this meant disposing of the necessity of abiding by the imposed rules of objectivity and rationality of the male-dominant realm of written expression. So in other words, we can say that it was a call for non-linearity, which echoed the intricate and dynamic relations between all components of life, as opposed to life's linear representations in the patriarchal inscriptions, authored as so-called objectively or as external observers of nature. So in the new materialist paradigm, this understanding is changing because we have a dynamic web of life here. And that's the way Siksu formulates her article, the way she writes, the way she points out towards Medusa, and she's moving Medusa from a negative figure to a more embraceable one, just like what Haraway does to Cyborg. This is an affirmative approach, and this reminds us of the posthuman feminism of Braidotti, especially. So this is not far away from ecofeminists of later generations, for example, if you ask me. For instance, a quarter century after Siksu's Medusa, Greta Gard would problematize the construction of reason as definitionally opposed to nature and all that is associated with nature, including women, the body, emotions, and reproduction. And along the same lines, again, queer feminist Catriona Sandilands would draw further attention to the influence of heteropatriarchal anthropocentric culture on nature, women, queer, and other oppressed peoples. So, next one, please. Then what makes Medusa posthuman, bringing all together, bringing them all, like, drawing a lot of parallels, and more than parallels, maybe drawing rhizomatic lines between various strands of feminism. Medusa emphasized fuzziness, complexity, and multiplicity rather than a one-way linear exit towards the ultimate truth, because it meant diversity in writing. What ecofeminists and later material feminists further polished was an emphasis on the body, with their reminder of diversity in the lived experience of women and all other bodies. I'm sorry, somebody has their microphone on. Yep, thank you very much for that. All these scholars were producing knowledges on how to battle against anthropos as a white, Western, heteronormative male figure who believes that whatever or whoever is different from him should be under his domain and at his service. But of course, what all these feminists did was to follow different pathways to reach their goal. Does this not recall then Rumi's poetry? The next slide, please. The ways may vary, but the goal is one. Don't you see that there are many roads to the Kabe? So I'm going to read it as Turkish here. For some, the road is from Rome. For some, from Syria. Others come from Persia or China or by sea from India and Yemen. The hearts are one in their longing and love. And that love is neither belief nor non-belief, for it has nothing to do with the various roads. Once we arrive, this argument and war and those differences in the roads, this woman saying to that man, you are false, you're an infidel, and that man saying the same about her. Once we arrive, we realize that such fighting is over the roads only. So in these lines, Rumi is kind of overcoming that unity versus difference dichotomy long before, centuries before it was theorized in Western philosophy. So I believe regarding the Medusa metaphor as only as a symbol of écriture féminine would simply misguide us. It's more than that. So Medusa also implies a flourishing possibility of becoming alive, and that reminds us of Ruth Miller's explorations of Braidotti about women's writing and life itself. She says, for example, it is specifically the act of writing as a female subject that makes possible an embrace rather than a rejection of biological vitality. So it is in this regard that I see resonances between Siksu's écriture féminine, ecofeminism, material eco-criticism, as well as material and posthuman feminisms. Now, let me turn to what Evelyn told us in her interview with me and how it kind of triggered a response in my brain. She also defines herself as a new materialist philosopher. She's a new generation philosopher. And she also found resonances between écriture féminine and contemporary material feminisms. And this happened so kind of arbitrarily without me asking Evelyn about what, I mean, I didn't ask her what she thinks about the links between different strands of feminism, but I mean, it just developed so. So that sort of randomness and that sort of arbitrariness is what I love about how it, I mean, rhizomatically unfolded. So it's like a self-poesis, autopoesis. She told me about the resonances between not with Siksu but with Irigaray, with Luz Irigaray's work. And of course, she is aware that Irigaray is not one of the first thinkers that come to mind when we think of this kind of set of theories. But she noticed that, like I did, Irigaray's work was crucial for projects that revalue matter and materiality, as well as for those that engage in a posthumanist decentering of the canonical subject men with a deliberate capitalization, because her work paved the way for the Deleuze-Guattarian new materialists such as Braidotti and Elizabeth Gross by focusing on the erasure of sexual difference and the prevalent existence of somatophobia in modern Western philosophy. So this is something I definitely concur with, but with one addition. I am also aware that Irigaray, Siksu, these people follow a completely different school. And I am also aware that Gross is clearly dissociating herself from ecofeminism, for example. I am also aware that Braidotti does not seem to be interested in ecofeminism anymore. But still, when we look at the patterns of diffraction here, patterns of interference here, there are patterns of repetition between their work and the work of ecofeminists like Val Plumwood and Greta Gard, especially in her critical ecofeminism. So it's a posthuman endeavor in itself. And this holds especially true if we consider their focus on the body and difference and their strong stance against the governing rules of anthropos, even if this is not always openly expressed in academia, due to our diverted attention to schools and isms. So those diverted attention is actually causing more problems than we need, actually. We cannot see the forest for the trees. So next slide, please. So you will see two quotes from Rumi. One of them is focusing on unity and the other one is focusing on difference. So the first one is what, I mean, it's one of my favorite ones. If you consider the roads, they are beyond counting with infinite differences, but when you consider the goal, they are all in accord with one desire. So here we see how from difference we can move towards unity. But in the second one, how you can, from unity, you can move back to difference, because he says, it is your road and yours alone. Others may walk it with you, but no one can walk it for you. So you can always consider yourself to be an individual, but still act in accord with others. This is what we mean. So with these two quotes, I believe Rumi provided relief for the concerns over the erasure of differences, which is still prevalent in today's Western philosophy. And such concerns, I believe, rise out of a negative bias against the relational process ontology from which new materialisms and material eco-criticism often borrow. Unlike in the Western thought, which has been striving for the past quarter century or so to overcome its dichotomy of unity versus difference via ecofeminist or posthumanist theories, the Eastern philosophies, specifically those involved in the lines of Anatolian poets like Yunus Emre, Hacı Bektaşi, Pir Sultan Abdal, for example, these are very familiar names to the regular Turkish audience, as well as, of course, Mevlana. I mean, these people have long accentuated or highlighted oneness and harmony while still reminding us of embracing diversity. So next slide, please. So in these two quotations, again, you will see Rumi's lines and another one by Marmon, a quote from Marmon talking about Rumi and when Rumi was alive and during his funeral. So it says, come, come, whoever you are. Wanderer, worshipper, lover of living. It doesn't matter. Ours is not a caravan of despair. Come, even if you have broken your vow 100 times. Come yet again. Come, come. So you can be with us, whoever you are. And I see somewhere along Posthuman Feminism 2022, Braidotti's new book, she says something like, I don't care which school of feminism you belong to, but we can achieve that sort of kind of posthuman affirmativity in her own words. But again, she refrains from stating not oneness, because I mean, when we say oneness in English, it automatically kind of feels reductionist, as if we're talking about a single number. But what we mean by one is not necessarily sameness, of course. And as you can see about identities here, even in his day, Rumi was sought out by merchants and kings, devout worshippers and rebellious seekers, famous scholars and common peasants, men and women. At his funeral, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Arabs, Persians, Turks, and Romans honored him. So everybody was there clearly. So evidently, to achieve unity, one did not have to erase their identity. And this identity does not only entail class, ethnic, sexual, or religious ones, or it might as well, it might involve gender identity, species identity. And from my situated positionality as a Turkish scholar that works on the posthumanities, coming from an English literature background, this is something I also find in both the ecofeminist and the Deleuze-Guattarian roots of posthumanism. Thus, as a result, of course, it kind of affects its ecological sibling, material eco-criticism. But of course, there is this problem of, there is the famous quote of Braidotti, I'm going to say, we are all in this together, but we're not one and the same. I understand why and how this maxim probably came to life, perhaps to avoid being accused of reductionism or essentialism or being, too monistic, etc. And I agree with it mostly, but why the need to underline not being one? Why are we so afraid of being one? Being one does not necessarily mean that you have to erase all your differences. Noting that posthuman subjectivity does not refer to an understanding of people as a unitary category, but comprises a heterogeneous multiplicity that cannot coalesce into unity on pre-given grounds. Braidotti almost defensively argues that people is not self-constituted as we the people. So from where she stands as a continental philosopher, I can relate to her rationale in doing so. She feels the need to emphasize this because she knows that she's going to be probably misunderstood. But what I read in these lines from where I stand, from my own position, is an effort to fine-tune the posthumanist concept of entanglement, which emphasizes togetherness, and the philosophy of difference, which meticulously strives to avoid sidelining any of the involved parties in that entanglement. So are we entangled? Or are we separate? Are we retaining our individual identities? It is both. But because those people, when you are attacked by all lines, you feel like you have to be defensive, and then you're writing meticulously and you're striving and you're carefully choosing your words, and we feel like we're walking on eggshells all the time. And I find this very problematic. So all of this shows us that we still have, even though we have this post-human turn in the Western thought, we still have a long way to go to achieve that post-human togetherness in a sense of unity and harmony, as the main dichotomy still persists. So next slide, please. So in my view, then, to tackle with such struggles, of course, requires deconstructing that Western idea of equating oneness with sameness. One is not necessarily a number that reduces our differences to the same identity, and viewing patterns of similarity along with those of differences may not always turn threatening. So being one or becoming one may not have to be the haunting specter that we must evade at all costs. Rumi's lines also attest to this. Someone comes along whom oceans do not satisfy, another finds a few drops enough, and any more would be harmful. So, considering how he calls for unity and oneness in his philosophy, these lines indicate that it is possible to become one and the whole, even when embracing, even when retaining your differences. As I often quote from Star Wars, embrace others for their differences, for that makes you whole. So next one, please. Returning to Medusa, then, I think she looks like a little bit like me. Okay. So we can say this. Although the snakes that compose Medusa's hair were depicted as the venomous and they were poisonous and they were thus associated with enmity and deadliness, it is also known that the serpent figure symbolized healing and medical powers in their relation to ancient Greek god of medicine Asclepius, as well as immortality and wisdom in many other mythologies ranging from East Asian to Persian to Anatolian. And after all, Medusa's head would literally ward off or turn away the evils. So in this regard, Medusa was not only an invocation of eco-spirituality in a way that echoes Kate Rigby's and Greta Gar's essays in Material Eco-Criticism, the book, but also it is poison and cure at the same time, reminding us of the Derridean pharmacon, for example. But it is also, I'm sorry, it is also invoking a spectrum of biophilia and ecophobia in terms that recall Simon Estok's hypothesis, which in itself, of course, bears resemblances to the position held by Sandilands and relies heavily on the material eco-critical perspectives of Iovino and Opperman. So we see a whole building. We see an entire entangled identities, just they are different. They are just differently expressed. That's it. And it brings together diverse elements that seem to be at odds with one another at first glance, hence the metatextuality, playing along with the transversalities between the post-structuralist and the material terms. So next one, please. So conceived this way, Medusa symbolizes both the creative life force and the creativity of written text. I argue that this was so in Siksu's terms too. It was both corporeal and inscriptional at the same time, summoning to the stage the Harveying material semiotic notes, Buridian material discursive practices, and my metatextuality, which binds the living and non-living matter and text in a manner that parallels Iovino and Opperman's storied matter. So we all know that these are different schools of thought, but this doesn't mean that they can never be brought together. So if Medusa conveys the vitality of the serpent and the woman, and if through meaning-making practices, that is the myths, her textuality has come to interconnect people's, especially women's knowing and being for centuries, then this makes her amenability with metatext quite clear. From this perspective, Medusa adds not only a more overtly ecofeminist touch with the snakes and the woman being one, being in the same body, into the concept of storied matter, but it also conjures up the enmeshment of the body and women's writing through écriture feminine, because she was Siksu's metaphor after all. So next one, please. Now I'm going back to the problem of unity versus difference. The idea of becoming with or worlding has repeatedly been discussed in the past decades by Barad, by Haraway, by Braidotti, along with a number of many other thinkers from similar cohorts. But the problem with this unity over difference issue still persists. This is because, from what I have observed, these people have difficulty in or deliberately refrain from expressing this very thought as becoming one with. So they say becoming with, borrowing from Deleuze and Guattari, which is nice, but what about becoming one with? Why do we kind of omit something? Why are we making up new words? Why are we trying to avoid the words that need to be staying there? I mean, I understand where they are surely coming from, but I believe these are actually anxieties over marking, not erasing differences. And returning to Rumi's lines, on the other hand, one could easily see that oneness or unity or wholeness, for that matter, does not necessarily mean sameness or reduction, nor does it have to lead to a wipeout of differences. It does mean, however, becoming entangled with, being, acting, and doing with together. So I'm going to borrow from Kate Rigby here to hold that nothing can be said to pre-exist its relational becoming does not imply a disregard for the singularity of things that do thereby come into existence, and that in their singularity are only ever partially disclosed to one another. And as Rigby notes further with reference to the Hegelian critique of Schelling, A philosophy or theology of interactive becoming does not necessarily plunge us into a night in which all cows are black. So we don't have to choose unity over difference. They can be both. So the next one, please. And this is going to be my finalizing lines. I'd like to finish by two recent examples of the Medusa remake that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. One, on the left-hand side, you see Jackie Oakley's depiction of Medusa, which was commissioned for Bitch magazine to accompany the American writer Mackenzie Schwartz's article, Snake Eyes, and the quote is from that article, actually. So Oakley's Medusa, instead of the well-known portrayals illustrating the Gorgon Queen, with venomous snakes in her hair and a grim expression on her face, this design is actually picturing her with the enmeshment of the serpents with colorful flowers and a proud face. Looking at the miniatures, the mini statue of the man in her hand with a condescending expression, Medusa is proud and she's aware of her power to overthrow Anthropos and his order of life as bios. And she's ready to replace it with a Zoe-centered worldview, in words that would Bredotti would probably use to describe it. So you can see how it is turned into an affirmative position of the woman, of the animal, of the plant. And I'll finalize, of course, the quote from Mackenzie Schwartz, who wrote about Medusa and Athena, saying that it was not a story of punishment and critique, it was a story of collaboration and support. As Barat says, why are we choosing critique? We could choose diffraction. We could choose supporting and collaborating instead. So Schwartz draws our attention to the roots of the problem once more. The narrative of women competing with one another is so ingrained in our storytelling that it can be hard to look past it and see the potential camaraderie between women in mythology and in real life, for that matter. But when we examine these stories and look at female relationships in relation to the male figures, we can start to deconstruct the patriarchal lens through which these stories are often viewed. We can gaze at the patriarchy so harshly that we can turn it into stone. So I suggest, as my final words, rather than assuming the male authoritative position of critiques, we need to acknowledge that Zoe-centered worldview, embrace differences while retaining unity, because why not? Thank you very much. Now I'm leaving the floor to Şafak.
Thank you, Başak. And thank you to the network for inviting us here today to share our ideas about the eloquent natures and also posthuman materialities. Similar to Başak's outline, I will be talking about some academic hierarchy problems and also the titles. And later on, I will move to a bunch of agencies, like the agency of the word or words, narrative agency. Referring to Başak, I will be talking about the meta text, and I will be referring to some literary and animated examples, actually, not the filmic, but animated examples from the British, Canadian, American, and Korean circles. And then I will be talking about the parts versus whole diagram in relation to the posthuman materiality, and finally pointing at this concept of symbiogenesis. I will be ending the talk with the poetics of posthumanism. So I would like to start with a quotation from Rosi Bredotti. Well, she says that restricted negatively by heteropatriarchy-based shared vulnerability, the guilt of ancestral communal violence, or the melancholia of unpayable ontological debts, but not by the compassionate acknowledgement of the human's interdependence with its multiple, like racial, gendered, and the like others. Western, mostly US and European academia, suffer from a hierarchy of posts and titles. We all know that. And maybe we can give its very example as the statements of diversity and inclusion and inclusiveness, which most of us who are applying to certain academic positions are expected to write indeed, is a little bit problematic in terms of the people who are coming from non-white, non-heterosexual backgrounds indeed. However, words matter, yeah, as Karen Baraz always say that. And in relation to this one, I would like to point at the poster of today's talk, indeed, because we have the agency of titles everywhere throughout the world, and it is also quite significant in Turkey. And just this very little word, for example, doctor, would be a little bit problematic for us if we didn't explain it, if we didn't make the amends here, indeed, because although I'm studying posthuman subjectivity, new materialist notions and the like, I'm also a part of this academia, and the doctor before my name is a violation of these hierarchies, at least in my circles, indeed. And the words are important in the term that, like, they seem to be the discourse, but we know that they lead to emotional, mental, and psychosomatic effects. Think about your, or I mean, I assume anyone who has a PhD would be having a psychosomatic problem. Think about your stress-related disorders, for example. These are all related to this one. However, when we look at the agency of the word, maybe we should return back to Kevin Barad, and who actually deconstructs the superiority of the discourse over the materiality in her concept of agential interactivity. She states the universe is agential interactivity in its becoming. The primary ontological units are not the things, but phenomena, dynamic topological reconfigurings, entanglements, relationalities, rearticulations. And the primary semantic units are not words, but material discursive practices through which boundaries are constituted. This dynamism is agency. So this brings us to a matter of written words, indeed. This picture is taken from Dr. Faustus's making a contract, a written contract with the devil, or Mephistopheles, as in Christopher, or I forgot the surname, Marlowe, Christopher Marlowe's namesake play. And there we realize the idea that anything that is written has its credibility. This adds up to the posthuman materiality and also posthuman agency of the word and also the matter. So it brings us to the literature and any narration outside the literature, which we can see in many media, and the narrative agency of non-human beings and materiality. So if you think that everything, regardless of their species, molecular structures, anthropocentric taxonomy, has its own narrativity or layers of its own epistemological textuality, these complex relations of becomings then, like literary tales, find a place to themselves as well in this discourse of narrative agency. In their introduction, for example, Introduction to Material Ecocriticism, Serenella Iovina and Serpil Opperman state, framed as material discursive encounters, literary stories emerge from the interaction of human creativity and the narrative agency of matter. Playing together, this shared creativity of human and non-human agents generates new narratives and discourses that give voice to the complexity of our collective, highlighting its multiple and fractal causal connections and enlarging our horizon of meanings. In other words, narrative agency and human creativity co-emerge in new and more complex levels of reality. Here, human and non-human players produce narrative emergences that amplify reality, also affecting our cognitive responses to this reality. So, if we think about the narrative agencies of non-human beings and materialities, then we should be looking at the non-human materiality and how non-humans, how matter deliver their stories in these ways. When we think, for example, non-human materiality, obviously we would be also thinking it's so-called binary human materiality, which brings us, which obviously brings our minds, our body, that human materiality. But when we think a part of our body as detached from us, like if we think about an amputated leg, and can we still call them human materiality, or can we still include them in this concept? Or do they begin their journeys as an ex-human matter or an ex-human thing, or as a matter of extension on the margin? For this reason, I will be looking at some narrative agencies of human and non-human materialities mixed in the Gulliver's Tale, in the Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, indeed. In this depiction, which is quite famous in the past editions of the book, indeed, we see Gulliver again resonating with the liberal humanist idea of the human superiority, looking down on the Lilliputians and showing his superiority to a certain extent, at least in the first book of the novel. However, when we look at the narrative, indeed, he is defined as a colossus. And even at the beginning of the novel, he is taken into the imprisonment of Lilliputian community as if it is a treasure that washed ashore from a shipwreck. And that's why his subjectivity is reconfigured from the first book to the fourth book by means of different non-human or semi-human or humanoid entities, by first encountering the Lilliputians and later on the giants like the Brobdingnagians, and later on with the Laputans, and finally with the horse race, the Hunanums. And this way, at the end, he accepts, let's say, his posthuman subjectivity by means of collaborating all the influences, all the relationalities of the web of life in his own identity. And likewise, in Lewis Carroll's Alice series, we see Alice wanders through the mannerisms of the Wonderland, and in one instance, maybe resonating with Başak's Medusa, when she eats a mushroom, her height changes. I mean, she gets taller, but interestingly, she gets taller as seen in this picture in terms of her neck. And this way, she is resembled by the pigeon to a serpent. And her conversation with the pigeon is quite striking in terms of stating that, and in terms of the narration of the pigeon and in terms of the perspective of the non-human, that the pigeon asks her, so your neck is long, I mean, you are so tall, you have a long neck, that means that you are a serpent. But Alice says, no, I'm a human. So the non-human bird, let's say here, asks what is human, that I have never encountered humans. And in that moment, Alice wonders also that what really makes human. So when we think about the definition of human, yes, we all continue defining human by taking our own self as the criteria of the human. However, when we start researching about the real definition of the human, and we always find out some average definition, some definition collected from the average statistics found on the earth, or according to some criteria of those scholars who define this term. However, as Rosemary Thompson Garland, in her book related to disability studies, which is entitled as Staring, How We Look, which is a brilliant book, by the way. And she also says that, like, human is defined by the average, and average is the, not the particular, not the does not refer to the particularities of each individuals. That is why individual perspectives would matter in our narrative, in the narratives, let's say, in altogether. For this reason, Lewis Carroll's I guess it is famous for me, but I don't know how, if you read it, like Some Popular Fallacies About Vivisection essay is quite interesting in terms of that, like referring to the 19th century practices of vivisection and also the medical procedures about some vivisection activities, some medical procedures who uses non-white people and also babies just for the sake of the improvement of medicine, and they are cutting through their bodies without using anesthesia and so on, because they believe that they will not suffer, they will not feel pain from these practices. And similarly, we see the traces of these in Alice. However, going back to the naming issue, and we can trace the naming, which also Jacques Derrida calls it problematic in his famous essay, whose title I forgot now, but anyway.
The animal that therefore I am.
Yes, the animal, thank you, Başak, the animal that therefore I am. There, when he was also referring to the naming problem, although the animal precedes the human in the Abrahamic religions, narrations indeed, they seem to be waiting for a man, obviously, who will be called Adam, to name them. They would be waiting for him to name them. However, in Ursula Le Guin's short story, which is a very bright short story indeed, and deconstructive story in terms of Eve's unnaming all the animals and also unnaming herself, because she never articulates her name. But it is clear from the story and the reference to the primordial she in the Bible. And she reverses the process of Adam's naming all non-human animals, reminding the reader of the autonomous positions of these animals, most of which already accepted namelessness and ignored their man-given names. Eve converses with numerous animals and realizes that most of them, like cats, insects, and all the sea animals, already rejected their taxonomic nomenclature and parted with all the Linnean qualifiers without hinting at an answer to whether naming issue has already prepossessed her or animalistic self-confidence has triggered her self-awareness. She cannot, in all consciousness, make an exception for herself either, and remains her name as if the name gained tangibility. Back to Adam, and indifferent. And in the story, Adam is seen to be indifferent and too busy trying to assemble the parts of the key to the Garden of Eden. And Eve's demand for a more inclusive experience points to the phallogocentric essence of God-given uneven power relations between the human and the non-human. Therefore, she recognizes the subjectivity of each species to name themselves generically or individually without human intervention, a process to which she herself is no exception. A similar thing can be found in T.S. Eliot's poem on the naming of the cat. Yeah, naming of the cats. And as a post-structuralist basis of post-human new materialist considerations, Derrida is somehow critically important here because he is also laying the ground for the coming new materialist post-human feminist discussion in that term. Another example can be taken from the British-American novelist Nicola Griffith and her prize-winning novel called Ammonite, because in it she talks about the change in our body and how becoming posthuman with the virus, or how becoming with the virus is related, let's say. But before that, before that one, so I skipped that. We have better to look at how Karen Barad defines or affirms the concept of change indeed. Change for her, for Barad, is a dynamism that operates at an entirely different level of existence from that of the postulated brute matter situated in space-time. Rather, what comes to be and is immediately reconfigured entails an iterative, interactive, open-ended becoming of space-time mattering, she says. The change toward becoming together in multiplicity in Griffith's Ammonite calls for a condition of togetherness, a combined existence of space, time and matter, and a diffraction of new lines in the narration of our existence during the disease times that we are also going through in this pandemic. So in the novel, there is a prediscovered planet called Jeep and ready to be colonized and exploited by humans. And not willing to miss this opportunity, a corporate space company builds a space station and sends troops to Jeep. And interestingly, a virus called Jeep also infects everyone, kills all the men and some women. Only some women discoverers could survive with the help of a kind of a vaccine which resembles to the vaccines of COVID-19 at the moment. So the protagonist, Marge, is an anthropologist and sent to Jeep and tries to contact with the natives of this Jeep planet. And there, in her journey, she contacts the virus. And during her journey of becoming one with the virus, she states that during her sickness stage, she says that she doesn't want to return to her body in that state of lying down with her temperature so high and so on. Like she just demands to be that because she feels herself unclean. And her partner there states, unclean? No, your body is changing just as it does every time you get sick. And another little piece of something else comes to live inside you. So if a child gets red fever, then when she's grown and her children get the spots, she will not become ill because the disease is part of her already and accepts her. Is this unclean? No, it's life. All life connects, her partner states. So here, this refers to our body's transcorporeality in Stacey Alamo's conceptualization, in which the human is always intermeshed with the more than human world. And this does not come to mean that all natural beings permeating human body is harmless to us. Obviously, we would be fighting against them to a certain extent. I mean, to the best extent, let's say, for the sake of our own survival. Yet again, with all these examples, we see humans' involvement in the process. But how I read Başak's concept of matter text is a little bit more non-anthropocentric, at least in my perspective, as one of the critics who just jump on a concept indeed. So as she states, matter text is an agentic tool that triggers change on the body, just as our carbon footprints, written on the atmosphere, or a viral code that is inscribed into the DNA. Such inscription, she states, does not essentially activate the involvement of a human form of existence, nor does it require the literal or metaphorical interpretations of a human agent. In fact, the human is only one of the many catalyzers at work in enacting both matter and text. So, as such, diseases and objects as matter texts resist against anthropocentric parameters of meaning-making, stereotyping processes, as all posthuman bodies and texts are. In Başak's word, matter text is in a constant flux of becoming. So how do they do that? In Barad's word, again, matter is substance in its iterative interactive becoming, not a thing, but a doing, a congealing of agency, which reminds us the performativity of Butler. So not merely a linguistic or cultural construct, then we can perceive matter as morphologically active, responsive, generative, articulate, and alive. Mattering is the ongoing differentiation of the world. And matter plays an agentive role in its ongoing materialization. Physical matters, matters of fact, matters of concern, matters of care, of justice are not separable from each other. For a more matter-based reading of non-human narrativity, for example, one can look at Jeffrey Jeffrey Jeremy Cohen's work on stone, which brings how, in my belief, matter text works, although he isn't referring to Başak's thing, obviously, because he wrote it many years ago. So in this posthuman materialism, one organism or body is not superior to another, since posthumanist philosophy is aware that all beings or bodies are connected to one another and built upon, as Gilles Deleuze and Guattari would remind us, 1,000 plateaus of relationalities and agencies since the very beginning of existence, and their interactive and intractive relations with us bring out unexpected narratives of becoming. For example, take Rowling's Harry Potter novels, and there the famous statement, "One chooses the wizard." From the movies and also from the books, mostly from the books, you would be realizing that these objects possess their own, let's say, will, rationality, or emotions or allegiance to certain human beings, indeed. Another instance to this one is those 6 Horcruxes. But what is interesting, but what is interesting in this example is that we know since the famous Cartesian cogito exclamations, there is a binary thinking of mind and body. But here, in these examples, a third entity is introduced as the soul, because Voldemort's parts of Voldemort's soul are put into these material entities for the sake of immortality, indeed. Why do we posthumanist scholars then constantly avoid religion or spirituality in our writings, in our talks? I assume, and I wonder your opinions about this one too, let's think it as a food for thought, that religion has already been a problematic area of scientific scholarships. And even in Immanuel Kant's hierarchizing the natural sciences and social sciences, which is still prevalent in today's academia, and even in that one too, we don't see religion. It is a totally separated realm of meaning making. However, when we think of posthuman materialities, or when we think of everyday practices that we are talking even today, and religion as a part of meaning making practices of our realities, our constant realities, I don't think it can be separated from posthumanist discourse either. So on that basis, I will turn back to the case of spirituality that is introduced, for example, in the animated series of The Legend of Korra. I don't know if my co-author is here, who is Süleyman Börükbaş, but in our last book chapter for Bloomsbury, and we are talking about the posthuman subjectivity and performativities of avatars, and there we refer to the posthuman performativity of non-human entities in this franchise, because they function to demonstrate, reform, and reconfigure the intricate web of natural, cultural, material, spiritual interrelations among humans and non-humans in a new materialist manner. For one who will be the first avatar, for example, spirits are absolutely other, or arrivant in Jacques Derrida's conceptualization. That is, non-humans are beyond his expectation and comprehension, and he needs a process of familiarization in this animated series. So spirits are also likewise unknowable to him before their several encounters and communications. In this picture, we see 2 great spirits of Rawa and Watu are fighting for the goodness, or the let's say the badness that will be prevalent in the planet. So in this posthuman becoming, or in this fight, we see a posthuman interference or an agential cut in Barat's concept that one introduces to the universe, and he separates both of them. After this instance, he is able to connect with Rava and reach to a level of posthumanness that contain two spirits in his own body. So one's non-anthropocentric approach to this world and the environment, as well as non-human beings, is best given in his exclamation, because he is unaware of any evil spirit and reacts to this seeing as that what you do concerns me, because when the lives of spirits and animals are in danger, it also matters to me. So this reconfiguration of posthuman becoming reflects the world as we know it in the animated series, indeed, that the material world and the spiritual world here given in this animated series also reflect to another non-human entity's ability to contain and change the course of the events in life by means of the tree of time, or banyan grove tree, as we see in this depiction, connected from their roots, speculatively connected from their roots. All these examples bring us to the interplays of these human and non-human agencies for posthumanist performativities, indeed. And differently abled bodies are told to coexist together without any supremacy of one over the other, indeed. In this regard, humanity's self-claimed norms like intellectual ability, anthropocentric physiology, consciousness, and rationality gets reconfigured with the equal distribution of these norms among spirits and humans and non-humans, indeed. All these point at a more than binary co-emergence and reconfigurations. Likewise, blood. I will be touching upon the topic of blood today. Before our talk, indeed, I was talking to my colleague, I guess she's here too, Mary Stutko, and we were talking about the agency of the blood that is a non-human entity that we see as an abject object outside our bodies, indeed, outside the body of a living being. And we always refer to its trustworthiness in terms of defining or pinpointing some criminal events, for example, or while we are looking at the legal parental lineage of not only humans, but also non-human beings like animals as well. So in order to prove the truth of one's saying, for example, imagine that I say I'm Queen Elizabeth's son, but words here, simple words, wouldn't be enough for anyone to believe in my saying. However, in order to validate my concern, people would be looking at or analyzing the blood, again, the non-human entity of the human materiality. Similarly, this brings us to the situation of the invalidity of mere discourse, because discourse is always related to materiality. In the case of posthumanist sense of agency, then narrative agency invites the possibilities of multiple agencies at work and relationalities among innumerable beings, which lead to equally innumerable becomings. So here, again, this is taken from, I can't remember which version, but from Dracula's a filmic version of Dracula. So again, in the Dracula, we see the reconfiguration of subjectivity through the transformation of bodily fluid. And these began to be presented as things of admiration. Maybe Başak would like to comment on this one, because I know that Dracula is one of the favorite narratives and movies about that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I actually have an article related to it, as you know. What I claimed in that article was that Dracula both presents a hierarchy and at the same time deconstructs the very same hierarchy that he constructs. I mean, this is how he does it. I mean, this person, this being, this entity is an undead figure. And he's both living and dead at the same time, just like a virus, for example. On one hand, he's the master of blood. He's kind of absorbing the agency of blood into his own body and therefore activating his own body through, I mean, he's like a parasite. But without the blood sucking practices, which is both material and discursive at the same time, because you're kind of sucking the life energy out of someone, but you're literally kind of transforming some sort of bodily fluid from one's body to your own. I mean, without those practices, he's actually nothing. And therefore, he traverses those boundaries. On the one hand, he controls the blood, but on the other hand, his life depends on it more than anybody else, perhaps. So he's kind of a very, I mean, I consider the vampire body as a posthuman hybrid figure that brings together the human and the animal and the object. I mean, let's remember the original, the novel, for example. I mean, he can shapeshift into a wolf, into a bat, into smoke. So he's not only becoming a non-human animal, but at the same time, he has the capability of turning into gas form. So he is playing with matter itself, right? You see, so I don't know. I mean, maybe there are other people who would like to comment on this because I mean, Dracula or the vampire figure, vampire body itself is very much open to discussion, not only in terms of blood, but also in terms of being a life versus non-life figure.
I mean, if there is anyone, you can raise hand. We will be stopping and talking with you too. So thank you, Başak. And in that perspective, we come to the part of parts versus the whole, or as Başak also stated, and the differences or unity. What are we looking at? So here, all these examples ask or beg the question of, is the whole as the sum of the parts more than the parts or any part that constitute that whole? Or are the parts more than the whole? Or can they be thought in different categories? Or do they beg for the question of their context and a more diffractive perspective? So obviously, the question hides its answer in itself, and because they would be asking for their context, we would be asking for the context, and therefore we should be looking at a more diffractive manner of reading what's going on around us or what's going on in the texts, because they are all relational, which brings us to the relationality of the posthuman materiality again. And this is from Penny Dreadful's version of Frankenstein's monster, indeed. So again here, let's remember Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And there, Dr. Frankenstein collected the bodily parts of the corpses and created a new being, which would be superior, or maybe in Nietzsche's term, ultra-human, indeed, Übermensch. So what is so deplorable, according to Dr. Frankenstein, of course, in that creation or in the monster? What is so abject or sublime in it? And the origin of the parts, which ones belong to the corpses, or the whole as a sum of these corpse parts? Is this the abject one? Or the immortality of such an entity, or a more superior subject? So, Başak, you wrote a whole chapter in your book about that one. What would you say about this?
Yeah, I mean, the case of Frankenstein is sublime and abject and scary all at the same time. And it's familiar at the same time. It's because, I mean, he's more than just a part of a body, but he's all the combination of dead body parts we know that those body parts actually belong to human corpses, and it reminds us of our own mortality. Perhaps to face it is a very difficult action, but at the same time, it's a being that is vibrant and alive. I mean, it's becoming human, and it is kind of threatening our agentic throne because he is becoming human. He's learning to be human. He's threatening his so-called father or the creator, Dr. Frankenstein. And so it kind of leads us back to the question of what makes us human. So facing the idea that are we simply collected parts of dead bodies that is endowed with consciousness. So is that all? So I mean, when we face this truth, when we face this fact, I think it's unbearable. One more point is that when the human tries to that kind of hierarchical order for itself, and it tries to climb to the top of that agentic throne, playing God, for example, it also feels comfortable because in the case of Dr. Frankenstein, for example, he doesn't know what to do with it because that position, that top position, belongs to somebody else, no matter how hard we try. So we're like losers, right? And that is why it's a very agentic figure in the sense that it tells a lot of stories within a single body. So there are multiple bodies within a body. This is all I would like to say. But I think Tutku was going to say something because she raised her hand.
I was also going to point at her because I know that she's studying, I mean, Tutku as a colleague of ours, she's studying Dracula and Frankenstein from really different points of view, from the Bill Brown's, for example, the thing theory. And he had actually a contribution which maybe she would be willing to ask her question and make her contribution here.
I have actually like two things to say about Dracula. I actually analyzed the novel from Renfield's point of view, not from Dracula, because like Dracula is just like a so obvious figure when it comes to, you know, taking matters in the hand, like whether you look at it from a Gothic perspective or like Posthuman or like any other. But we have a minor figure in the novel that is Renfield. It is kind of like a mockery of Dracula, actually, when you think about that. And that's why it is easier to see, because like his actions and his situation is so absurd that, and less frightening and less threatening than Dracula's, that it is actually easier to see how this, as Başak said, the hierarchy works. For example, what we have in Renfield, he is lower on the food chain, I guess you can say. That's why instead of consuming humans or blood, he uses birds, insects, cats, actually. And even when he is feeding on these animals and like other, you know, beings, he has a hierarchy too. So he starts with insects and then moves to mice and then birds and then cats. So, and he actually explains himself. He's more vocal about it than Dracula. He's more like, you know, philosophizing about this than Dracula in the novel. And he says that by consuming the life out of them, he is getting the life for himself. So as this is actually supports what Başak said, but more in a concrete terms, I guess we can say. And with Frankenstein, I was going to say when Başak said it is multiplicity of bodies, and like, you know, it isn't actually literally not a single body. Like literally it is anything but a single body. And it brings the question Şafak asked, like whether the whole is more valuable or more important than the parts that make it up, or vice versa. So I was just going to comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tutku. And again, in this relationality, we can look at one example of endosymbiotic hypothesis or symbiogenesis, which is related to mitochondria in our bodies, in our cells indeed. Or we can think human as a whole, human as a part. How can we value that? And according to the endosymbiotic hypothesis, which is the leading evolutionary theory of the origin of eukaryotic cells from prokaryotic organisms indeed, and mitochondria and chloroplasts in the plants, as well as certain other organelles, were once upon a time a part of single-celled organisms according to this hypothesis. They were free living prokaryotes, for example. However, they have been throughout the evolution or through the time constitutively become companion species in Haraway's word, and they, humans and the mitochondria, for example, humans and mitochondria, they made up each other in the flesh and significantly other to each other in specific differences. They have engendered a kind of divine bonding indeed. So we see here a relationship of mutual supplementarity. And as Roberto Marchesini, the Italian philosopher, also states, indeed, our very existence now depends on openness, because without hosting the other or without hosting alterity, humans would be sterile. So this brings us to poetics of posthumanist narratology or posthumanism indeed. When we see from these examples of different genres, different sciences indeed, posthumanism or posthumanist literature or narratology begs for the inter and transdisciplinary nature of literary and cultural studies indeed. Therefore, these examples that I give belong to a realm of transmedia. And in transmedia, you can see the representations and their proliferations in lots of other medias, like the game, the filmic representations, or their even post-productions as toys and so on. Therefore, it brings us also to a different perspective of the representation of these beings, posthuman materialities, in non-conventional and non-canonical genres. Yes, science fiction and fantasy literature classically is thought as an escapist literature, but outside that, it is actually a literature of possibilities that demands us to ask the question, when do we look for stories? Specifically, when do we ask for questions of posthuman philosophy or theory indeed? Obviously, we come up with such theories when the scientific findings alert us against the catastrophic future indeed. And again, we look for stories mostly when things go astray or when things go wrong, because we are trying to put, most of us, most of the humans, try to put the blame on mostly non-humans or other humans, which actually leads to a very conventional issue of humanity, the hypocrisy at its best indeed. So most of the time, we are trying to dethrone the human from its superior position, but at other times, we can just skip away from the responsibilities of what's going on around us by just saying that I'm only human. Humans can err. Yeah, that's all. Thank you very much.